So, what does it mean to be self conscious, self aware, conscious? All of us, hopefully, are at least semi conscious right now. But what does that actually mean when we dig into it? How does sociology give us some answers to this question? So, George Herbert Mead and before him Charles Cooley, um, both not heavily published in their time, really wanted to dig into this question from a social perspective. They didn't assume a transcendental soul of any kind. They wanted to know, how does society create self-consciousness? And if you think about what that means, it's sort of right there in the term. You are conscious of yourself as a thing. Right? You think about yourself as a thing. Um, as you go out and you dress to go outside and perhaps you do your hair in some way, you're thinking about how people see you, and you're seeing yourself as others will see you. Um, we call this concept the looking glass self, a looking glass simply being a mirror. And the looking glass self is this concept that we learn to see ourselves and we become self-conscious through the people around us. We begin to see ourselves as they see us. And then eventually we begin to take on a perspective uh, of our own towards ourselves. We are taking a stance sort of outside of ourselves towards ourselves. Right? So we begin by seeing ourselves in the way others see us. Me watching you, watching me, if you will. This idea of the self is very different from the ideas that we have of ourselves as something that's fixed and stable over time that doesn't really change. This self is constantly emergent, meaning it emerges from social interactions that we engage in every day. As you leave your home and you go to college, or stay home and go to college in this instance, you're interacting with different people, you're interacting with professors, and maybe you're finding a different voice, a different self in those interactions. And this is a lifelong process. Socialization and the creation of a self is always ongoing in this view. You are always being and doing yourself, and it's changing as the world and the relationships change around you. How does this happen? Well, George Herbert Mead, a social psychologist and philosopher, gave us a couple stages that we're going to dig through in this video. We'll start with the preparatory stage, move into the play stage, and finally end up in the game stage. We can think of these as stages we go through as young children. It's mostly complete by the time we're 7 or 8. And it's a process of beginning to take on the aspects of society around us. In the preparatory stage is when we're very young infants, and we don't really have much tools to really engage and interact with anyone. My goddaughter at this point is a couple of months old, and even in that short period of time, as her eyes develop, as her vocalizations develop, you can see a lot of change as she's able to register people and faces and behaviors. She starts to recognize gestures with hands, with faces. You can gesture with your face. We often do. And at some point soon, she'll probably start imitating them. And this is what happens in the preparatory stage. We've all been in the grocery store and seen a baby, perhaps smiled at it, and the baby has smiled back, and it's a nice thing. Unless you hate babies, in which case, what's your deal? Who hurt you? Anyway, the baby likely smiles back, but the baby doesn't actually know what smiling means. It means happiness and joy and kindness. The baby is merely imitating a gesture it recognizes. And this is the first kernel of self-consciousness. As young infants, we start to realize that particular movements of our facial structure, particular vocalizations, crying being a big one, starts to get reactions in the world around us. And this is how we start to become aware that we are a thing in the world, that we are a self, because we do a thing, we act, and the world around us reacts to us. Right? The world changes. And in that instance, we become aware, much like looking in a mirror, and as we move our hand, we see the hand in the mirror move. The baby becomes aware that certain gestures get certain kinds of responses, but first it's just that they get responses at all. At this point, these gestures, these movements of the face, crying, very early verbalizations, it's all very much an imitation. The baby doesn't know the meaning behind it. And this only comes slowly with formal education and with socialization in the household. Now, as we get older, we begin to move into the play stage. And this is where we're still imitating, but we're learning more complex symbols of language. So we go back to our discussion of culture. We're learning the meanings behind certain symbols. And we're also learning that there's different roles that people play. Now, at this stage, we think about, 3 through 5 years old, maybe a little older. Who are people mostly interacting with? This is who we call their significant others. Often this is parents, teachers, maybe a priest or someone in the church. But this is the primary, and of course, peers, our friends. These are our significant others, and they begin to shape those roles that we play. And we are playing at roles. We are imitating those roles. So if you think about the games many young children play, maybe they play house, they play grocery store, right? They play what they see around them, and their parents take them to the grocery. They don't really understand the system. Right? If it's in a traditional heterosexual household, they know that there is a mommy and a daddy. Many things on television and in books will tell them this is the normal structure. And children are very quick to pick up on these rules as they engage in this play of role-taking. Keep in mind, this isn't without an element of inequality and power that's a little bit more hidden. Think of games like Cops and Robbers, Cowboys and Indians. These are already giving us certain narratives about particular people, that the Cowboys are the good guys, the Indians are the bad guys. Hopefully parents aren't letting kids play this game too much anymore. But even playing house, we're learning traditional heterosexual ideas about what a family is. Kids often call each other out if their family structure doesn't have the mommy and the daddy. Maybe it's just a single parent household. This is how we start to learn some of those bigger, more problematic rules at the same time. So in the play stage, we don't really get the bigger picture. We're playing at roles, but we can't really grasp the bigger game in society because we don't understand it at that level. Think of a kid playing ball. Right? They throw the ball, somebody else catches it, they throw the ball back. They're not really playing games at this point. We're not even to that playground point where you're playing games with complex sets of rules. Somebody throws the ball, somebody catches it. There's not a pitcher, there's not a catcher, there's not a batter. It's very simple stuff. Only later on when we enter the game stage do we start to get some of these more complex types of interactions. Right? In the game stage, children start to understand how many different roles fit together and the rules and norms that relate these roles to each other. Think if you ever played kickball or dodgeball on the playground. You know the different rules, you know who's who, you know there's two teams, you know you have to either run or steal a base. If you think about a complex game like football, early Pee-wee leagues are kind of chaos because kids they like to whack the ball on the T-ball stand, but they don't really get the bigger game. But as you get older, you start to learn the rules and the point of the game. You start to learn that you have a role as the first baseman or as the outfielder, and you know that everybody else has a role on your team, and they have a job, and that if everybody does the whole role, the whole thing kind of works together. So here's where we start to get a bigger picture. We're not just focused on our own position. If we think about young children, they're really very self-absorbed. At this point, we start to get a bigger picture of everyone else's role. We can take other roles. We can, in our minds, start to take on the position of what is the catcher thinking? What is the first baseman thinking? What is the opposing linebacker thinking? And these are all metaphors, but we can also start to do this with parents, with friends, with our teachers. So at this point, we're taking on many different roles. We're engaging in more roles ourselves. One thing we have to do, according to Irving Goffman in this point, is engage in impression management. Um, Goffman gives us a set of ideas about how life is much like a stage, and that we have to, as we take on a particular role, we have to manage the impressions of those around us. How do they see us? How do they think about us? Um, on the playground, you might be learning your first swear words, and you want to seem cool to your friends, so you say them out loud, and everybody knows it's wrong. But when you go home, you don't shout them out in front of your parents because you want them to still think of you as their child and as a good kid. Unless you swear at your parents, which what's wrong with you? Who hurt you? So these stages of the development of self, we move through the play stage, in which role taking is very imitative. Um, Kids are very set on rules in the play stage, particularly the rules they learn. I often tell the story of how my nephew had a breakdown when I started cutting up a banana the first time I ever took care of him. He had a 20-minute meltdown because I sliced his banana, because his mother didn't do that, and that's not how you do banana eating. Um, and if you think about kids in these early stages, they don't really get the bigger set of rules about how to behave, that how other people are thinking about it. Those kids who are wailing in the middle of the grocery store, they don't care about your norms and whether they're bothering you. They want the Hot Wheels toy, and they're not really concerned with the rules. As we get further and further socialized and we develop a greater sense of self, we're able to take on a kind of general position towards ourselves. In those early stages, we're thinking of ourselves as those significant others see us, right? So we understand that our mom would be mad if we stole a toy at the toy store. We understand that our dad would get angry at us if he caught us swearing. But as we develop a more generalized other, we can take a general attitude towards ourselves. And here we're taking on the general attitude of a society we live in. Here's where we learn the rules that it's wrong to steal, that we shouldn't take from others, that swearing is seen as kind of crude and crass. Um, we're not thinking just in terms of how our mother or a friend or a teacher would see us. We're taking the general perspective of society towards ourselves. This is what we call the generalized other. And this is what you're exercising right now. You literally see yourself from the general perspective of society. What I want you to think about for our class time for our discussion is, what does this mean in a society like ours, in which women are treated as lesser, and which non-white people are treated as lesser? How does that general perspective of society, when that society is white supremacist and patriarchal, how does that shape our view of ourselves?